This is Q59 to Rego Park, Queens Boulevard, 62nd Drive. Next stop, Broadway and Roebling Street. This stop is Broadway and Roebling Street. Next stop, Broadway and Bedford Avenue. Transfer available to B62. This stop is Broadway and Bedford Avenue. Next stop, Broadway and Wythe Avenue. This stop is Broadway and Wythe Avenue. Next stop, Broadway and Kent Avenue. This stop is Broadway and Kent Avenue. Next stop, Kent Avenue and South 6th Street. This stop is Kent Avenue and South 6th Street. Next stop, Kent Avenue and South 3rd Street. This stop is Kent Avenue and South 3rd Street. Next stop, Kent Avenue and South 1st Street. This stop is Kent Avenue and South 1st Street. Next stop, Grand Street and Wythe Avenue. This stop is Grand Street and Wythe Avenue. Next stop, Grand Street and Bedford Avenue. Transfer available to B62. This stop is Grand Street and Bedford Avenue. Next stop, Roebling Street and Grand Street. This stop is Roebling Street and Grand Street. Next stop, Metropolitan Avenue and Hadmire Street. This stop is Metropolitan Avenue and Hadmire Street. Next stop, Metropolitan Avenue and Rodney Street. Transfer available to B24. This stop is Metropolitan Avenue and Rodney Street. Next stop, Grand Street and Union Avenue. Transfer available to the G train. This stop is Grand Street and Union Avenue. Next stop, Grand Street and Lorimer Street. Transfers available to B48 and Q54. This stop is Grand Street and Lorimer Street. Next stop, Grand Street and Graham Avenue. Transfer available to B43. This stop is Grand Street and Graham Avenue. Next stop, Grand Street and Bushwick Avenue. Transfer available to the L train. This stop is Grand Street and Bushwick Avenue. Next stop, Grand Street and Waterbury Street. This stop is Grand Street and Waterbury Street. Next stop, Grand Street and Morgan Avenue. This stop is Grand Street and Morgan Avenue. Next stop, Grand Street and Metro Bridge. This stop is Grand Street and Metro Bridge. Next stop, Gardner Avenue and Grand Street. This stop is Gardner Avenue and Grand Street. Next stop, Grand Street and Grand Street Bridge. This stop is Grand Street and Grand Street Bridge. Next stop, Grand Avenue and 47th Street. This stop is Grand Avenue and 47th Street. Next stop, Grand Avenue and Page Place. This stop is Grand Avenue and Page Place. Next stop, Grand Avenue and 54th Street. This stop is Grand Avenue and 54th Street. Next stop, Grand Avenue and 56th Street. This stop is Grand Avenue and 56th Street. Next stop, Grand Avenue and Russ Street. Transfer available to Q39. This stop is Grand Avenue and Russ Street. Next stop, Grand Avenue and 59th Street. This stop is Grand Avenue and 59th Street. Next stop, Grand Avenue and 58th Avenue. This stop is Grand Avenue and 58th Avenue. Next stop, Grand Avenue and 61st Street. Transfer available to B57. This stop is Grand Avenue and 61st Street. Next stop, Grand Avenue and 64th Street. Transfer available to Q58. This stop is Grand Avenue and 64th Street. Next stop, Grand Avenue and 66th Street. Transfer available to Q18. This stop is Grand Avenue and 66th Street. Next stop, Grand Avenue and Queens Midtown Expressway. Transfers available to Q67 and Q18. This stop is Grand Avenue and Queens Midtown Expressway. Next stop, Grand Avenue and 69th Place. This stop is Grand Avenue and 69th Place. Next stop, Grand Avenue and 71st Street. This stop is Grand Avenue and 71st Street. Next stop, Grand Avenue and 73rd Street. This stop is Grand Avenue and 73rd Street. Next stop, Grand Avenue and 74th Street. This stop is Grand Avenue and 74th Street. Next stop, Grand Avenue and 79th Street. Transfer available to Q47. This stop is Grand Avenue and 79th Street. Next stop, Grand Avenue and 84th Street. This stop is Grand Avenue and 84th Street. Next stop, Grand Avenue and Haspel Street. This stop is Grand Avenue and Haspel Street. Next stop, Grand Avenue and Van Horn Street. This stop is Grand Avenue and Van Horn Street. Next stop, Grand Avenue and Queens Boulevard. Transfers available to the M&R trains, Q60 and Q53 SBS. This stop is Grand Avenue and Queens Boulevard. Next stop, Grand Avenue and 55th Avenue. This stop is Grand Avenue and 55th Avenue. Next stop, Queens Boulevard and 56th Avenue. This stop is Queens Boulevard and 56th Avenue. Next stop, Queens Boulevard and Woodhaven Boulevard. Transfers available to Q52 SBS, Q53 SBS, Q11, Q21 and Q29. This stop is Queens Boulevard and Woodhaven Boulevard. Next stop, Horace Harding Service Road South and Queens Boulevard. This stop is Horace Harding Service Road South and Queens Boulevard. Next stop, Junction Boulevard and Horace Harding Service Road South. Transfers available to Q72 and Q88. This stop is Junction Boulevard and Horace Harding Service Road South. This is Q59 to Rego Park Queens Boulevard 62nd Drive. Please exit through the rear door.